Can you believe the bay trash they let operate here? The words, spoken by a man whose crisp polo shirt cost more than my monthly fuel bill, cut deeper than any winter wind on the Chesapeake. He stood on the Annapolis dock, his face a mask of disgust as he glanced from my old boat, the Tidewater Ghost, to my calloused hands. His friends snickered, their laughter echoing over the water. The crumpled $20 bill he'd tossed at me felt like an anchor in my pocket, dragging my pride down into the murky depths. Burning with a quiet, helpless rage, I pushed my boat out into the gray, choppy water just to be alone. That's when I felt it, a violent lurch, as something heavy and solid fouled my propeller. Cursing my luck, I leaned over the stern and saw a dark, lumpy shape tangled in the blades. It looked ancient, sinister, a secret the bay had kept for centuries. Would you have the courage to get closer? Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Silas Croft. I'm 42 years old, though some days the salt and the sun make me feel twice that. I was born on the Chesapeake, just like my father and his father before him. The bay isn't just water to me, it's in my blood, a mixture of salt and memory that flows through 3 generations. My boat, the Tidewater Ghost, was my father's. Her paint is peeling, her engine groans like an old man getting out of bed, but she knows these waters better than I do. She's my home, my office, and my only inheritance. We work the tides together, running small charters for tourists who want a taste of the real bay, or pulling up crab pots in the misty dawn. It's not a living, not really. It's a subsistence, a way to keep my head just above the water that threatens to swallow me whole. Living in a place like Annapolis, you learn your place quickly. It's a town of 2 worlds. There's the world of the gleaming white yachts, of men in crisp polo shirts and deck shoes that have never seen a fish gut. And then there's my world, the world of calloused hands, the permanent smell of brine, and the quiet dignity of hard, thankless work. The 2 worlds exist side by side, but they never truly meet. They just collide, and when they collide, it's always people like me who end up bruised. For years, the symbol of that collision, for me, was a man named Mr. Sterling. He was the Commodore of the yacht club, a man whose family had made a fortune in shipping 2 centuries ago and had spent the time since looking down on those who still worked the water. He saw my Tidewater Ghost as a personal affront, an eyesore polluting his pristine view. I remember one morning I was hosing down my deck and he strolled down the dock, a gold-embossed blazer slung over his shoulder. He stopped and stared at my boat, not at me, but at the boat, as if it were a piece of trash that had washed ashore. "Croft," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, "is that rust bucket of yours leaking again? There's a sheen on the water near my hull. I'd hate to have to report you to the port captain for environmental negligence." There was no sheen. He just wanted to remind me that he could crush my livelihood with a single phone call. I just nodded, my jaw tight. "I'll check it, Mr. Sterling." There was nothing else I could say. Arguing would be like a minnow trying to fight a shark. You just get eaten. Another time he saw me talking to a family of tourists, explaining the history of the watermen on the bay. He waited until they were gone, then cornered me by the pilings. "You should be careful what stories you tell, Croft," he warned, a thin smile on his lips. "We have a certain image to maintain here. We don't need you reminding our guests of the less fortunate aspects of the local economy." Less fortunate. That's what I was to him. Not a man, not a part of the bay's history, but an unfortunate aspect, an inconvenience. The humiliation was a constant, low-grade fever, a sickness in my gut that never went away. It wasn't just him. It was the smirks from the yacht crews, the way shopkeepers would watch my hands when I paid in crumpled bills, the unspoken understanding that I was from the other side of the tracks, even when those tracks were made of water. But the day it all changed started like any other Tuesday. The sky was a flat, dull gray, the color of a tarnished spoon. The air was thick and heavy, promising a storm that couldn't make up its mind. I'd had a charter that morning, the one I told you about. A man with a polo shirt so white it hurt my eyes, and a wallet so thick it looked like a brick in his pocket. He and his friends had treated my boat like a carnival ride, laughing too loudly, pointing, making jokes about the rust stains and the patched-up seat cushions. When we got back, he peeled that crumpled 20 from his money clip, the gesture itself an insult, a dismissal. And then came the words, the 2 words that would echo in my head for the rest of the day. Bay trash. He said it to his friend, but he meant for me to hear it. He wanted me to know my place. And I did. In that moment, I felt it more keenly than ever. I was just a ghost on the Tidewater, unseen, unheard, a piece of driftwood in a harbor full of shining vessels. The $20 bill felt hot in my hand like a brand. I didn't want it, but I needed it. I shoved it in my pocket, the paper crackling in protest. I didn't say a word. I just untied my lines, the rough rope a familiar comfort in my hands, and pushed the ghost out into the bay. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to be away from the docks, away from the laughter and the judgment. I needed the vast, indifferent gray of the water to swallow the burning shame in my chest. I cut the engine a few miles out, letting the boat drift on the choppy water. The silence was a relief. I was alone, just me and the gulls and the low, heavy sky. And that's when my day stopped being ordinary. That's when my whole life stopped being ordinary. I felt a sudden violent lurch, a sickening thud that vibrated up through the hull, followed by the tortured sound of the engine stalling. My propeller. I'd hit something big, cursing my luck, my day, my entire existence. I leaned over the stern, expecting to see a log or a submerged crab pot. But it wasn't a log. It was something dark and lumpy and ancient-looking, tangled in my propeller blades like a secret the bay had tried to keep hidden. What would you have done? Would you have risked damaging your only livelihood to pull that strange, heavy thing from the water? Let me know your thoughts below and subscribe, because you won't believe what was waiting for me inside. I stared down into the churning gray water, my knuckles white on the stern. The silence was deafening, broken only by the slap of waves against the hull and the frantic pounding of my own heart. My engine, my livelihood, was dead. And the cause was this thing wrapped around my propeller like a drowned beast. My first instinct was pure, hot anger. Of all the rotten luck on this day of all days, it was probably a discarded trawl net, a waterlogged mass of rope and debris that would take me hours to cut away, likely nicking my prop blades in the process. Another repair I couldn't afford. Another bill to add to the pile that was already threatening to sink me. I grabbed my longest filleting knife, its edge worn thin from years of use, and leaned dangerously over the edge. I just wanted it gone. I didn't care what it was. But when I plunged my arm into the frigid Chesapeake water, the shock of the cold was nothing compared to the shock of what I felt. It wasn't a net. It wasn't a log. It was solid, unyieldingly dense and wrapped in something slick and leathery, like old, oil-soaked canvas. I tried to find a tier, a loose end, anything to get some leverage, but there was nothing. It was a single, seamless lump, wedged tight. Pushing and pulling did nothing but make my shoulders scream in protest. The boat rocked uneasily, and for a second, I imagined myself slipping, falling into the murky water, and getting tangled up alongside whatever this was. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I was completely alone out here. No one would even know where to look if I went under. I pulled myself back, breathing heavily, my mind racing. This was no ordinary piece of bay trash. It was too heavy, too solid. The rage was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping dread mixed with something else. A flicker of curiosity. I've been on this water my whole life. I've pulled up anchors from the 1800s, waterlogged crates, even the dashboard of a 1950s car. I know the feel of the things the bay swallows. This felt different. It felt intentional, like it wasn't lost, but hidden. I stood there for a long time, just watching the dark shape bob beneath the surface, a knot of indecision tightening in my gut. I could try to cut the whole thing loose, risk damaging the prop shaft, and limp back to shore with my tail between my legs, or I could try to haul it aboard. The idea was insane. Judging by the strain it put on the engine, it had to weigh hundreds of pounds. The Tidewater Ghost wasn't a crane. She was an old boat, and I was just one man. But the thought of leaving it there, of never knowing what it was, began to gnaw at me more than the fear. That tourist's words echoed in my head. Bay trash. Maybe that's all this was. A final cosmic joke. The bay itself sending me a piece of garbage to foul up my engine and ruin my day, just to prove him right. Something inside me rebelled against that. No, I wasn't going to be beaten by a piece of junk. I was going to face it. I was going to pull it from the water and see what it was, even if it was the last thing I did. My curiosity had become a form of defiance. I grabbed my gaff, the long wooden pole with a steel hook at the end that I used for hauling in heavy catches. It felt flimsy in my hands, a toothpick against a monster. I leaned over again, the boat groaning under the shifting weight, and plunged the hook deep into the mass. It bit into the canvas with a sickening tear. I planted my feet on the deck, took a deep breath, and pulled. Nothing. It was like trying to pull the anchor of a battleship. I gritted my teeth, bent my knees, and put my entire body into it. My back screamed. The muscles in my arms felt like they were being ripped from the bone. The gaff handle creaked, threatening to snap. Slowly, agonizingly, the shape began to move. It didn't want to come. It felt like I was pulling a secret from the very guts of the bay, a secret that had been held for 100 years and wasn't ready to be told. Inch by inch, I dragged it upwards. The strain was immense. Sweat poured into my eyes, stinging, blurring my vision. The boat listed precariously to starboard, the water level rising dangerously close to the gunwale. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to capsize, that this thing was going to pull me and my father's boat down into the dark with it. I should have stopped. Any sane person would have let go, but I couldn't. I was possessed by a stubborn, desperate need to know. As it broke the surface, the water cascaded off in a muddy, foul-smelling sheet. It was a sack, a huge, dark canvas sack, wrapped in oilskin that was cracked and peeling like ancient skin. It was bound tight with thick, tarred ropes, sealed in a way that was meant to be permanent. It looked like a body bag from a nightmare. My heart hammered against my ribs. What in God's name had I found? Was this evidence of some terrible crime? Was I pulling a man's coffin onto my boat? The fear was a physical thing now, a cold hand squeezing my throat. But I was committed. It was halfway out of the water, a dead weight hanging off the side of my boat. Letting go now might do more damage than finishing the job. I gave one last, desperate, guttural roar of a pull, leveraging the gunwale, using the last ounce of strength I had. The sack slid over the edge and landed on the deck with a heavy, wet, and final thud. The sound wasn't the clatter of metal or the soft thump of waterlogged wood. It was a dense, solid, compact sound. The sound of immense weight. The boat rocked violently, then settled, now sitting lower in the water. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my whole body trembling from exertion and adrenaline. There it was, my passenger. A dark, silent, ominous shape lying on my deck, reeking of brine and century-old rot. It was bigger than I'd thought, and heavier. Far, far heavier than it had any right to be. The mystery was no longer hidden in the depths. It was here, at my feet, and I was the one who had brought it into the light. Looking at that sealed, forbidding sack, 1,000 terrifying possibilities flooded my mind, and a single overwhelming question. Would you have had the courage to pull this thing up? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to find out what I did next, because my life was about to be torn apart by what was inside. I dragged the monstrous sack into my shack, the floorboards groaning under the obscene weight. It lay in the center of my small room, a dark, wet stain spreading on the worn wood, smelling of the deep black mud from the bottom of the bay and something else, the faint chemical scent of old tar. For a full hour, I just stared at it. It was an invader, a creature from another time that had breached the hull of my life. The waves lapped rhythmically against the pilings below, a sound that had always been a comfort, but now it sounded like a slow, ominous drumbeat counting down to a verdict. My filleting knife, the one I'd used to gut thousands of rockfish, felt ridiculously small in my trembling hand. Taking a deep, ragged breath that tasted of salt and fear, I knelt down and sawed at the first of the thick, tarred ropes. It was like cutting through cartilage and bone. The fibers were stiff, ancient, and fought me every inch of the way. When the last rope finally gave way with a dull snap, I peeled back the stiff, cracked oilskin. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Underneath was another layer of heavy canvas, stained dark by the water but still remarkably intact. There were no markings, no clues, just a blank, silent shroud. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I sliced through the canvas, my knife making a long, ripping sound that seemed to tear the silence of the room in two. The smell that hit me was not of rot or decay. It was the dry, dusty smell of things long hidden from the light. Inside, there wasn't a single large object, but dozens of smaller parcels, each tightly wrapped in what looked like faded sailcloth and tied with thin, waxed cord. They were packed in with dried seaweed, a brittle brown cushioning that crumbled to dust at my touch. I picked one up. It was heavy for its size, about the size of my fist, and felt dense, solid. My mind raced. Gold bars, antique pistols. I fumbled with the knots on the cord, my calloused fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. Finally, I just cut it. I unfolded the cloth carefully, layer by layer, as if I were unwrapping a sacred relic. And then I saw it. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a weapon. It was a rock. A dull, greasy-looking, grayish crystal, about the size of the top of my thumb. It had an odd, cold weight to it, an internal fire that seemed to absorb the dim light of my shack rather than reflect it. I felt a crushing wave of disappointment. I had risked my boat, my life, for a sack of ugly rocks. But something made me pause. I picked it up. It was harder than any stone I'd ever held, and when I turned it in the light, I saw a flash, a deep, prismatic glint from within its cloudy surface. My grandfather, a man who had seen a bit of the world before settling on the bay, had once shown me a picture in a magazine. A picture of a diamond. Not the sparkling, cut gems in a jewelry store window, but a raw, uncut diamond, straight from the earth. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. That was the stuff of movies, of treasure hunters in faraway lands, not for a waterman in a shack on the Chesapeake. With shaking hands, I opened another parcel, and another, and another. Soon the floor around me was covered, dozens of them, some small as a pebble, others as large as a gull's egg. They weren't beautiful, they were raw, primal things, but lying there on my dirty floorboards, they held a power that was terrifying. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I just watched them, occasionally picking one up, feeling its impossible weight, its cold, ancient promise. On the third day, I knew I couldn't live with the not knowing. I took one of the smaller stones, wrapped it in a rag, and drove for 3 hours to a small, dusty jewelry shop in a town I'd never been to before, a place where no one knew my face. The jeweler was an old man with hands that shook and eyes magnified by a thick loop that hung around his neck. I unwrapped the stone and placed it on the velvet tray on his counter. He picked it up, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. He lifted his loop, and the world went silent. I watched his face. The curiosity melted away, replaced by disbelief. Then his eyes widened, and a pale, waxy color drained from his cheeks. He put the stone down as if it were burning him. He looked up at me, not at my face, but through me, his gaze filled with a profound mix of awe and pure terror. He leaned forward, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. "Where?" he said, his voice barely audible. "Did you get this?" I just shook my head. He licked his lips. This is a Type 2, internally flawless. The clarity, I've never seen anything like it." He gestured vaguely at the stone. "A sack full of these? Of varying sizes. You're not talking about money. You're talking about a geological event. You're talking about a fortune that could buy a small country." I pressed him. I needed a number, a real number to anchor myself to. He scribbled on a pad, his hand still shaking, then pushed it towards me. I looked down. There was a 7, followed by a 0, and a lot more zeros after that. $70 million. The drive back to Annapolis was a blur. The number didn't feel real. It was an abstraction, a sound, not something that could belong to me. When I got back, I didn't go to my shack. I walked down to the main dock, the one where the big yachts gleamed under the afternoon sun. I saw him then, Mr. Sterling. He was standing with the same man who had called me bay trash, pointing out some feature on his pristine sailboat. Sterling saw me coming. His face tightened into its usual mask of disdain, ready to make a comment about my boat, my clothes, my existence. But I just looked at him. I didn't scowl. I didn't look away in shame. I just met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. He must have seen something different in my eyes. Not defiance, but a kind of calm, profound indifference that he couldn't comprehend. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. The man with the polo shirt just stared, a confused look on his face. They couldn't place it. I was the same man in the same worn clothes, but I was no longer on their map. I was a ghost they could no longer see, because their world, the one built on money and status, had become infinitesimally small compared to the secret I was carrying. That $70 million sack wasn't from a pirate ship. The canvas, the ropes, the preservation. It felt more recent. Maybe Prohibition-era smugglers or a wartime payroll that never made it to shore. A secret sunk in the bay, waiting for a piece of so-called trash to find it. The weight of that secret is heavier than any sack of diamonds. What would you do if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments and subscribe, because deciding what to do next was the most dangerous part of all. That $70 million number wasn't a key, it was a bomb. It sat in my shack, ticking, threatening to blow my life to pieces just as easily as it could save it. For a week I was paralyzed. I'd sit with the sack, surrounded by those greasy, cold stones, and feel the weight of 100 impossible decisions crushing me. Turning them in was out of the question. The government would take them, bury me in questions I couldn't answer, and I'd end up with nothing but a prison sentence for my troubles. Trying to sell them locally was just as stupid. News of a waterman with a pocket full of raw diamonds would spread through Annapolis faster than a nor'easter, and I'd have every thief and federal agent from here to Delaware kicking in my door. The old jeweler's terrified face was my guide. I had to disappear to become real. I took the $10,000 I had saved over a decade, packed a duffel bag with a dozen of the smaller stones, and bought a one-way bus ticket to New York City. I walked into the Diamond District looking like what I was, a fish out of water. But money, I learned, has its own language and it doesn't care about your accent. I found a man in a dusty office high above 47th Street, a man whose eyes didn't show fear or awe, just cold calculation. He didn't ask where they came from. He just weighed them, tested them, and named a price. It was a fraction of their value, I knew that, but it was still more money than my father had made in his entire life. I walked out of that office with a cashier's check that made my hand tremble. I did it again the next month, and the month after that. I became a ghost, a whisper in the market, a man with no history who sold stones from an unknown source. Over the course of a year, that $70 million bomb was disarmed, piece by piece, and reassembled into a fortress of numbers in a Swiss bank account. When I came back to Annapolis, I was different. The change wasn't on the outside. I still wore my worn boots, still drove my old truck. I even kept the Tidewater Ghost. But the stoop was gone from my shoulders. The furtive, apologetic way I moved through the world had vanished. I bought my shack and the land it sat on, then the entire spit of marshland around it. I paid cash. I had the Ghost hauled out, not for a patch job, but for a complete restoration. Her hull was reinforced, her engine replaced with a silent, powerful new diesel. She was the same boat, but her heart was strong and new, just like me. The town noticed, of course. The rumors started. Some said I'd found pirate treasure. Others, more realistically, figured I'd won the lottery and was smart enough to keep my mouth shut. Mr. Sterling and his crowd watched me from the corner of their eyes. They didn't know what to make of me. I was an anomaly, a piece of bay trash that no longer fit their definition. The final turn came at the annual Yacht Club fundraiser. I wasn't a member, but a 7-figure anonymous donation had earned me an invitation. I stood at the back, just watching. The highlight of the evening was the auction for the A1 dock slip, the best spot in the harbor, which was currently occupied by Sterling's prized yacht. He was bidding on the renewal, a smug, proprietary look on his face. The bidding stalled. He had it. Then, from the back of the room, I raised my paddle. A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling turned, his eyes locking on mine. He saw me, but he didn't understand. He smirked and raised his bid. I raised him again. The auctioneer's voice grew excited. The bids climbed, leaving the realm of reason and entering the stratosphere of ego. His face went from smug to confused, then to a dark, flushed red. The smirk was gone. This wasn't about a boat slip anymore. This was about him trying to put me back in my place and me refusing to go. He finally threw his paddle down in disgust when the price hit a number that could buy a nice house in town. The slip was mine. I never did put a boat in it. I left it empty. A silent, gaping hole right in the heart of their perfect, pristine world. A constant reminder. Sometimes I'd see Sterling on the docks. He'd look at me, then at the empty slip, and then back at the Tidewater Ghost, purring at her mooring. He never spoke to me again. The man who called me trash, the man with the crisp polo shirt, I saw him one last time. He was crewing on another man's boat. He looked at me, his face pale, and I just gave him a slow, simple nod. There was no triumph in it, no anger. What do you say to a man you could buy and sell 1,000 times over? You say nothing. Their judgment, their world, their money. It had all become so small. But the fortune didn't quiet the real question. It only made it louder. I still take the Ghost out into the bay, but not for charters. I have the best sonar money can buy now, and I sweep the bottom foot by foot. Where did that sack come from? The way it was sealed, the oilskin. It felt like it was from the 1920s. Maybe a Prohibition-era deal gone wrong. A gangster's treasure, sunk and forgotten. Or was it older? A lost payroll from the Civil War? Why was it right there, in that one spot, in 1,000 square miles of water? And why did my propeller on that one day, at that one moment, find it? Was it the only one? Or is there more down there, waiting in the cold black mud? The money fixed my life, but it broke my understanding of how the world works. I'm no longer bay trash. But what I am now is a man haunted by a $70 million mystery that the Chesapeake gave to me, and me alone. Do you believe a story like this could really happen? That a man's life could be turned upside down by one lucky or unlucky snag of a propeller? Tell me your theory. What do you think was the real story behind those diamonds? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe to the channel for more stories the water doesn't want told, and tell me where you're watching from tonight.